Islam my deen, Allah my Lord, His word Quran, Muhammad Prophet, praise be upon, I'm a Muslim for all of time.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا وبعد. We begin in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the especially merciful. We praise Allah Azza wa Jal, for He is deserving of all praise and recognition. We invoke the peace and the blessings of Allah upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon his family, his companions, and upon you and I and everyone who follows in their path until Allah Azza wa Jal inherits this earth and everything on it. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Islamic Concepts. These episodes we agreed would touch upon a different concept, different Islamic concept every day, and would explain it in a simplified way that we would better understand when we perform some of these concepts and know their specific, their general and their specific meanings. Today, the concept that we'll explain is the concept of niyyah wa ikhlas. Niyyah is intention, ikhlas is sincerity. Niyyah, being the intention, is involved in every act of worship we do. Actually, niyyah can turn an act which is a habit into an act which becomes an act of worship to Allah Azza wa Jal. Before I touch on this, let's quote the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In a famous hadith accepted and agreed upon by the majority and the consensus of the muhaddithun, the scholars of hadith, narrated to us by Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu, the second successor of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Indeed, all deeds are dependent and based on their intentions. وَإِنَّ لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَّا نَوَى وَلِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَّا نَوَى. And to every individual they will be given what they intended. Now let's go back to the beginning of the hadith. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Indeed, إِنَّمَا here, the word or the adat here is known as hasr. It's limiting all deeds to this specific condition of intention. In other words, if any deed is done without or void of any intention, then the deed is void itself. And it's dependent on the intention. Is it intended for the sake of Allah? Then it's correct, on the condition that it's also within the path of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In other words, the intention is sincerely for Allah, and at the same time the act is in accordance to the prophetic way, the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yet the word a'mal, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ, indicates indeed all deeds, not just a few deeds or some of the deeds, but all deeds are dependent on their intention. And deeds in Islam, we know, are either by the tongue, the heart, or the bodily actions that are performed in different ways or different manners. All these types of deeds that are performed, they depend on what are they intended for. What are they intended? Are they intended for Allah Azza wa Jal, for a worldly matter? It differs. The difference is the heavens and the earth. And even when it's intended for the sake of Allah, is the intention sound, pure? Has it been polluted by any kind of showing off, what's known as riya? Has it been polluted in any way by directing one's attention to other than Allah Azza wa Jal. Again, the ranking of this intention will vary, and hence the reward will vary. So the importance of understanding the concept of niyyah is extremely important for a Muslim. And every act of worship, whether you are performing wudu, or you are performing salah, or you're performing any form of act of worship, even the habits that we mentioned earlier. If I go to the grocery store and I want to buy the necessities for my home, if I intend that I'm doing this for the sake of Allah, that I'm supporting my family for the sake of Allah, it turns into an act of worship. And I am rewarded for this act as it being something that I did for the sake of Allah. Hence the importance and the magnitude of the intention when it's involved in any act, and specifically the acts of worship that the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has specified and set for us to implement. But the habits can be included, and this is where the famous saying of the scholars, إِذَا صَحَّتَ النِّيَّةِ, if the niyyah is correct and proper, تُحَوَّلَ الْعَادَاتِ إِلَى عِبَادَاتِ, the habits can turn into acts of worship. And this is all depending on how I present my intention properly. Now, with this emphasis on intention, it doesn't mean that we become concerned in a negative way of what type of what my intention. Of course, if I perform wudu, I'm performing wudu, inshallah, for the sake of Allah. Just make sure that the purification of this intention is a process that you continue to establish. And to further understand how this can be accomplished, the concept of ikhlas comes into this course of understanding. Ikhlas is sincerity. You begin with the intention for the sake of Allah, but then you continue in the process of sincerely performing it for the sake of Allah. You're not performing it to impress someone besides you or near you, or your boss or your father or your mother or your brother or anyone else, but you're doing it for the sake of Allah, and you're sincerely, continuously renewing this concept of sincerity for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. And this is what Allah Azza wa Jal created us for. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. And they were not commanded other than to worship Allah sincerely, and to sincerely make the efforts of their acts of worship for the sake of Allah. This is the purpose of life. And it begins with the concept of worshiping Allah sincerely. And the ranking varies as much as the sincerity varies. In Surah Al-Mulk, the chapter known as the chapter of the dominion, or Tabarak, the chapter of Tabarak, Allah tells us, هو الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. It is He who created death and life, that He would try you, He would test you, who amongst you is the best in deeds. Now, Allah didn't say more in deeds. Allah didn't tell us abundant in deeds. Of course, quality here is emphasized, but quantity also is encouraged. The more one does, it's good, but the quality of the act, which is dependent on your intention and your sincerity to Allah Azza wa Jal, this is the essence that Allah is testing us by. And how can my deed become magnified, even though sometimes the person might be doing the minimum in acts, but because of their intention and their sincerity, their pureness and sincerity for the sake of Allah, they far exceed some people who might be known to do acts of worship continuously during the day, during the night, but because they've lacked this concept of purity and sincerity, they might have decreased in the rank, whereas someone who might have done less or a little bit lesser than them have far exceeded them because of the pureness of their sincerity for the sake of Allah. Hence the meaning of أحسن عملا, the best amongst you in deeds. And the concept of it being the best was commented on by Al-Iyad, the famous judge earlier in the history of Islam. Al-Qadi Iyad was known to be amongst the scholars and the ones who were worshippers of Allah Azza wa Jal, and his quotes are well recognized in many of the works of fiqh jurisprudence. He said, explaining this ayah, or commenting on this ayah, how can a deed become better, best? He said, ما كان أصوبه ما كان أخلصه وأصوبه أخلصه وأصوبه. And these are the two conditions for the acceptance of any deed. أخلصه, what was sincere for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal, meaning the intention was pure, meaning that it was sincerely done for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. And then he said aswabuhu, and the most correct. And the correctness here is related to the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this involves the two conditions of the acceptance of any act of worship in Islam. It has to be done for the sake of Allah. The intention and the sincerity here is involved, and I intend it for the sake of Allah, and then I sincerely perform it for the sake of Allah, and I push any attempt of showing off that might creep into my heart, trying to pollute the sincerity of this act for the sake of Allah. This is number one. Number two is that I do it according to the prophetic way, the prophetic sunnah, the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If I lack one of these two, then the act of worship is problematic. It might be void, it might be even blameworthy, and one has to be certain that these two conditions apply to any act of worship, whether they're mandatory or voluntary. If they apply, then the act of worship is a blessed act, and one should carry on with this act. Of course, some might ask the question, well, I get this feeling that someone is watching me, so I get this understanding that maybe I'm showing off. This is a natural feeling. It's part of the test that we go through. As long as you don't go with that feeling and enjoy it, and you push it away, you drive it away by reminding yourself that you're doing this act for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal, then that's the sincerity purifying itself, magnifying itself. I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to purify our intentions, to make us slaves of His worship, sincerely worshipping Him, and to magnify our sincerity and purify it for us, and guide us to the ways that please Him, and accept from us our deeds, and to forgive us our shortcomings. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
I am a Muslim, Islamite, Allah my Lord, His word Quran, Muhammad Prophet, praise be upon Him. I'm a Muslim for